Assalamu alaikum students, hope all of you doing very well. The topic today I'm here to continue that is the Second World War. Some of you have already done some of the topics of this chapter. It's page number 80 to 85, but here I'm again recapping the chapter, the topics. Before I start the chapter, here is the previous knowledge which you need to know about, as we have done before in the previous chapter. We have discussed that how did the events of the First World War affect the politics of the continent. Then we discussed about the British Parliament passed the Rowlatt Act. We have also discussed the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And then we discussed about the idea of a separate Muslim state. Then we discussed the Nehru report which was presented at that time. Non-cooperation movement we have already discussed. In the last we discussed about the roundtable conference. Right, there were 3 roundtable conferences which were held in London with the cooperation of the British Parliament. It's Unit 9, the Second World War. Okay, first of all, now we are going to discuss that is how far did the Second World War change the world. It was the era of 1920, just after the First World War. First World War ended in 1919, in the start of the 1920s. This was the decade of the 1920s was relatively peaceful for the world, and the new League of Nations managed to sort out some of the small-scale disputes. However, the Great Depression in 1930 changed the economies of the nations around the world. During the First World War, we have seen there were some of the difficulties of the economic instability which was held in that era, that was suffered by some of the big powers. On that time, League of Nations, one of the international organization that was formed, right, but it was only able to sort out the issues at a small scale. Now here is the origin of the Second World War. First one, we have seen that with the help of the League of Nations, there was a Treaty of Versailles which was signed between the countries, right, specifically Germany and Japan. It is said that this treaty was not fair to Germany and it became one of the causes of the Second World War. The League of Nations could do nothing to stop them. It was quite weak international organizations. That's why it is said that to secure more resources and power for its weakened economy, it is said that Japan wanted to secure its economy, right? And he thought that it is a threat for him. So Japan invaded Manchuria at that time. That was actually under the control of the China. And the League of Nations criticized Japan's action when it attacked Manchuria. So it was very critical condition. So League of Nations, when criticized it, in 1937 Japan went to the war against China. And later on he started expanding in the Far East. One of the leaders of the Germany, that is said that he was Adolf Hitler, leader of the Nazis, became the chancellor in 1933. So he was very much angry, and then he started to take the action against the restriction of the Treaty of Versailles. As it has been signed at the end of the First World War. So Hitler's first step was to rearm Germany, but the League of Nations took no action to stop him. The Depression had severely weakened Britain's and France's economies. As we have seen that this was the First World War, the big powers, they were already suffering the economic issues and the economic trouble. And their people, they never ever wanted to war again. So nevertheless, they began build up their armies and weapons, as this reduced unemployment and increased industry as it had in Germany. So Hitler has taken another step to annex or to join German-speaking Austria. German-speaking Austria and part of the Czechoslovakia to the Nazi state in 1938. Right, the British and the French prime ministers met Hitler in Munich in September 1938. They agreed that Germany could take over these regions because they did not want another war. So, this was actually the policy of the appeasement. This policy of the appeasement or the policy of the happiness towards the Germany due because of that threat the big powers were thinking about. Okay, then we have seen in March 1939 Hitler brought the whole of the Czechoslovakia state under German control, but he did not stop there. Later on, he started invading other countries. Just like Poland, Britain and France could not allow this to continue because they have already present the policy of the appeasement. And thus the Second World War began. Later on, the Germans had invaded Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Britain fought back and Germany lost the air battle over Britain later in 1940. In 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Here you can see Hitler did not stop here. So USA has stopped exporting materials needed for weapons to Japan. USA was the only country who was actually exporting weapons to the other countries. So he stopped to export it to Japan because the Japanese had invaded part of China and might attack other countries, other territories in Southeast Asia. So Japan attacked American ships at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And this brought the USA into war. Here you can see the picture that actually shows how did the Japan invaded USA. In the same scenario, you can find there were some of the main Axis states: Germany, Italy, and Japan. Some of the Grand Alliance states, these are the Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. Now we are moving towards the impact of the Second World War on the empire. Here we have seen the war placed a great strain on the British Empire, and it brought about the defeat and the collapse of the France. Soldiers from all Britain dominions and the colonies were called upon to fight for the mother country on their own continent in Africa or Asia, and overseas for those in Australasia and Americas. Here we have seen that during the First World War and in the Second World War, the presence of the Britain in some of the colonial states, and these states were actually Asia and Africa, that was actually under the control of Britain. And Britain was suffering the great critical issues and the situations in the world. These were actually the economic critical situation. So the greatest shock came in 1942 when the Japanese defeated the British force and captured Singapore. There were heavy losses faced by the Britain and the France that shook their empires. That is 1940s. Then later on, the nationalist movement were started across their empires, made it hard to keep control of their colonies after the war ended in 1945. You have seen in the subcontinent that British were ready to leave all the colonies or to keep independence in these places. And the French government had to consider whether it was worthwhile to keep their empires. In some cases, like the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East, Britain left quickly. But in others, such as in Africa, this was not the immediate plan for the decolonization. Then we have seen the atomic bomb. This war was actually in Europe came to an end in May 1945 with the collapse of the Germany regime in Germany, but the war in Asia was still being fought bitterly between the American forces and the Japanese. The American president, he was actually ready in 1945 for the new experimental weapons, that is atomic bomb, and then he decided that swift massive destruction would force Japan's surrender and thereby end up saving thousands of the American lives. So historians have argued but American motives. Even since the attacks, some have said that it was an aggressive attack, right? Or the act was a show of force to the Russians, who could be rival to American power. The bomb was dropped on the cities of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that actually causing around 200,000 deaths. Japan surrendered 6 days after the Nagasaki bomb exploded. The survivors suffered for years after the war ended due to radiation and the other injuries. So all the situation and the critical situation was going on at that time. Now we are coming towards the United Nations because the League of Nations was actually failed to maintain peace and stability in the world between the countries and among the countries. Now the new organization was formed, that is international organization, that is the United Nations. In 1945, there were delegates for 50 nations meet in San Francisco to set up the United Nations. The main aim and the main objective was that to promote international peace, cooperation, and solidarity in the world. That is actually based on the principles of the equality and self-determination for all the peoples. It means that United Nations has to follow the principles of the equality, and they must give the independence to those countries they are not independent and they are the part of the colonies. Another aim is that to send the peacekeeping forces to world trouble spots. That wherever they found that countries are not stable and they are facing war conditions, right? And United Nations must send its forces to these countries. So finally, United Nations Security Council was set up and the 5 permanent members, Britain, France, USA, and the Soviet Union and China, right? And 6 other temporary members. It had the power to send peacekeeping forces to the world. But each of the permanent members had the power of veto to stop actions. Power of veto means that if any country is complaining about another country, so any of the 5 permanent member can veto the power of other country or to stop the other country to present that document in front of the United Nations. Now we are moving towards the Cold War. Here you can see some of the pictures on page number 82, right, which will be very helpful regarding the atomic bomb and the United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York, USA. Now we are moving towards the Cold War. What was actually the Cold War is? The Cold War is actually not the direct military war between the countries. It was actually the ideological war, where the Soviet Union and the United States had entered the Second World War on the side of Britain. But the leaders, then Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, these were the leaders of the Soviet Union, United States, and the Britain. They did not agree about the purpose of the war or what should happen afterwards, because they thought already we have suffered just after the First World War. In the same way they have suffered, there were injuries and the killings of the thousands and the millions of the people, and they never ever wanted to go for the war again. So the main thing was to win the war, and that was done. The Soviet Union wanted a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to stop invasions of Russia. So the location, if you find the location in the map, you can see that Soviet wanted a buffer state, right, itself, that it can save or stop the invasion of Russia in the Eastern Europe. specifically by the Germany. So the Soviet Union and the USA never declared upon open military war against each other, but instead there was a war of the ideologies, one promoting defending communism and the other promoting and defending capitalism. Around the world, this became known as the Cold War. Okay, the security of the Stalin meant having communist governments in these countries, but the other allies wanted to support democratic free elections throughout the world. So these were the countries where they started their war between the communism and the capitalism. The British did not think freedom and democracy meant independence for all its colonies in Africa and Asia. So the thinking of the British that is quite different, but the Americans and the Russians did not support European imperialism. In the end, the Soviet Red Army occupied Eastern Europe and ensured that communist regimes were set up there over the next few years, sometimes forcibly, as in Czechoslovakia in 1948. So they tried to enforce other countries. So these were the two superpowers. They developed their nuclear technologies, and the world came to fear the possibility of a third world war during 1950s and 1960s that might bring about world destruction. This tension lasted till until 1989. Here you can see some of the very important points I have summarized about the Cold War, that your concept of the Cold War must be clear. There was no peace between US and the Soviet Union. There was a competition for world dominions and the global power, that these two countries they both wanted to continue their power. Fought on political and the economic fronts rather than on the military battles. Even though the threat of the war was always present, it defined American foreign policy from 1946 to 1989. This was actually the Cold War era. It affected domestic politics and how Americans viewed the world and themselves. It was a constant state of military preparedness and arms race. This was a propaganda war actually between the democracy or the capitalism versus communism. There was a clear US policy that support nations threatened by the communism. Now, capitalism versus communism. Here I'm giving you or explaining about these two ideologies. Capitalism is actually free elections where more than one political party, industry and agriculture owned by the individuals, right? People can run their industries and the industrial sector, different social classes, freedom of speech is there. But as far as communism is concerned, here they believed on actually the business would never share their profits fairly with the working people, and the only way to increase wealth for everyone was to government to own all businesses and share the wealth equality. That everything must be in the hand of the government. That is called as a one party state. No different social classes. Industry and agriculture owned by the state. Government controls people's lives. There is a strong censorship, the strong control on the people. Here the topics which I have covered for you, right? Some of the its effect are here in your book, page number 83. You have to read it thoroughly, right? And the map that is present that shows the Western Europe and the Eastern Europe. Keep it in your eye and try to focus on it, and do the conceptual reading of this chapter from your textbook, right? And mark all the important points and the dates in your notebook. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you.